It's 8:35 Central African time, and it's time for our hashtag Africa Focus feature. This is a part of the show where we turn our lens, our focus to some of the continent's biggest stories. And this time around, we'll be heading over to Nigeria, the giant of Africa, which has announced the arrest of two of its most wanted militant leaders in what officials are calling the most decisive blow against insurgency in years. The man, Mahmoud Mohammed Usman, linked to Al Qaeda affiliated Ansaru, and Mahmoud al Najiri, the leader of a newer group known as Mahmouda, were captured in a multi agency operation that spanned several months. Both have been accused of orchestrating high profile attacks, including the 2022 raid on Kuje prison that freed dozens of Boko Haram fighters and a 2013 assault on a uranium facility in Niger. Authorities say the arrest could cripple militant networks that stretch far beyond Nigeria's borders, with links into Mali, Niger, Pekin, and Burkina Faso. But questions remain. Will this strike truly dismantle these groups, or is it only a temporary setback in a country where extremism has deep roots? And to help us unpack all of this, I'm now joined by Nigeria-based international relations expert, Dr. Mukhtar. Imam is coming to us live from Abuja. Doc, thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum. Really appreciate you giving us your time this morning.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Doc, I think let's start with the significance of this moment. Nigeria is calling this, well, the Nigerian government is calling this the decapitation of militant leadership. How much of a big of a victory is this for Nigeria?
Well, I think this is a very pivotal moment in the fight against terrorism, banditry, and other related vices. As far as the country is concerned, these issues are essentially one of the most pressing at the moment. Of course, security is a continuum. It's the primacy of the existence of government. Therefore, wherever a government succeeds, no matter how insignificant it might appear, in um, in curbing the acts of terror, in curbing terrorist or banditry related activities, it tends to applaud such situation. Um, no, no, this is no small feat. As a matter of fact, considering that these are individuals who are high ranking in these terrorist cells, it sends a strong signal, of course, of government's readiness to ensure that it curbs terrorism and terrorist-related activities across the country, especially at a time where we're seeing a rise globally on issues related to terrorism, meaning that terrorist cells are no longer local. They're no longer confined to the boundaries of certain countries. The internationalization of terrorism and terrorist-related activity is one that is beginning to, affect government across borders. So, of course, this is a very important moment. It signifies something great with regards to the war, the fight against terror and terrorism. And so the government is taking, is amplifying its voice as far as this success is concerned.
Mm, And I think that's very, very important to note. One question that I have is, both of these men were accused of orchestrating major attacks, including, I think I mentioned in my intro, that infamous Kuje prison break back in 2022. What does their arrest mean for the groups that they lead, Ansaru and Mahmouda? Do these groups just simply collapse without them, or simply regenerate under new leaders, as it's often the case with some of these insurgent groups?
Well, the activities of terrorist cells and terrorist group has been one to always continue. There's always a succession from what we know. There's never been a time where these terrorist groups or terrorist cells just disappear as a result of the killing of their leadership. they're very organized, they're very
mm,
structured. In recent times, they have become even much more organized and much more structured. Their activities and operations, activities have become even much more advanced in terms of having a certain structure, hierarchy, and so on and so forth, chain of command, their cells, the syndicate, how they operate. They have become, even much more sophisticated in recent times. So it will be naive to anticipate or assume that because you have taken out the head of the group, that the group is just going to disappear or that they're just going to dissolve, or whatever nomenclature we choose to use. The reality is, history has shown, and other terrorist activities, other terrorist groups such as Boko Haram, and of course ISWAP. I mean,
mm,
with the killing of the leaders of Boko Haram. If that would have been the case, we would have seen Boko Haram disappear or dissolve or just, vanish into thin air. But with the killing of Mohammed Yusuf, with the killing of Al-Barad, Al-Barnawi, and so on and so forth, what we saw, as a matter of fact, was an even much more sophisticated and even much more enhanced Boko Haram. So the reality is that, and the same can be said about Al Qaeda, the same can be said about the Tuaregs, the same can be said about Al Shabaab, and so on and so
mm,
forth. We've seen time and time again where their leadership or those who are at the helm of affair get killed, and they're replaced almost immediately with even much more fierce and gruesome individuals, like in the case of Boko Haram, for example.
mm,
When Mohammed Yusuf was there, yes, it was radical, it was their views, and so. But as soon as Mohammed Yusuf was killed, you see, Abubakar Shekau came, and Shekau became even much more brutal than Mohammed Yusuf was. So the same can be said of Mahmoud. The same can be said of uh, um, the leadership of this particular Ansaru group that has been arrested. We never can tell. What government needs to do is look beyond just capturing the individuals at the helms of affair to ensuring that the group itself is dissipated. And then, of course, beyond that, look at the sociological issues that have given rise to these terror groups in the first place. Because you see, the kinetic measures in themselves are not sufficient to address the situation. We need to also adapt and adopt. A lot of non-kinetic measures will have to be brought in. A lot of proactive measures would have to be taken to
mm,
ensure that we don't even see the rise of these groups anymore. We need to look at the root causes, what exactly that deep conversation has to be had to be able to understand. But as far as the group is concerned, there is absolutely no, no, it is not far-fetched that the group will certainly, find its base again. And of course, like I said in the beginning, they have become more sophisticated. There's always a succession plan. No doubt this has dealt a great blow to the group. It will take them a while to, to digest this, to chart a new course. We hope that we begin to see the end to these things. But like I said, it's going to be very naive to assume that these groups are just going to vanish.
mm, mm. And I think that's the most concerning part. And I think this leads to my next question to some extent. I just want to take like a broader, bigger picture to this conversation. Nigeria, I think, as you mentioned, has battled these insurgency groups like Boko Haram, like ISWAP, like Ansaru, and now a number of other rising so-called bandit groups for more than a decade now. Why is militancy in Nigeria so resilient despite repeated military operations? This is not the first time, that you would have these high profile leaders of some of these organizations either killed or arrested, but it just doesn't seem to put an end to the rise of these groups. I think every few years, every few couple of months, there's a new one that pops up its head and does really, really incredible damage to the lives of the people of Nigeria.
Well, this is where you need to psycho-evaluate. Like I said earlier, you must understand the sociological and root causes of some of these issues. It is not enough to assume that kinetic measures are sufficient to tackle terror groups or banditry or crime, whatever form that crime takes. All over the world, there are crimes of various nature. Nigeria is battling with its own terrorism and banditry. You find in other climes there are youth restiveness. You find in some other climes that various versions and variants of these issues, and they're all tied to. I mean, like I said, you need to psycho-evaluate. You need to understand the root causes of these issues in the first place, because you see, the one thing that is more contagious than a virus is an idea. And an
Mm,
idea, once implanted in an individual, could take a lifetime to take out or to redeem. So it's crucial that you understand the root causes and so on and so forth. As far as militancy and terrorism is concerned, um, sociologically speaking, they have, there are stages to it. And of course, when it begins to evolve, that's where you have it at the very rudimentary preliminary stage. The moment they begin to form groupings, and then the moment they begin to have hierarchy or they are now organized, which is the third layer, and then the fourth layer is when they begin to carry out coordinated strikes and attacks. It's not something that you can just erase all of a sudden. Like I said, you see, you'd have to look at how they function. They have become sophisticated. It started as a national crisis. Today, it has become internationalized.
mm,
The motivation
mm,
has become even much more advanced. Their sophistication in terms of weaponry, in terms of network, in terms of access, have become even much more sophisticated. It is not something that you can just wipe out all of a sudden. If it were, Al Qaeda wouldn't have been here today. If it were, Al Shabaab would have left the Maghreb. If it were, the Tuareg wouldn't today be existing in Mali, and so on and so forth. So the same can be said of terrorism in Nigeria. It has taken that dimension. It used to be Boko Haram, today it is ISWAP. It's the same thing, it's just the change in nomenclature. And the reason for
mm,
the change in nomenclature is in the fact that it has now taken another dimension. It is now aligning itself with the major terror cells from around the Maghreb into the Middle East. So these are some of the issues that essentially will have to be looked at, and these are the major reasons why you find that terrorism doesn't really give way so suddenly. Nigeria is a very complex society. Nigeria is a
mm,
very strategic country. It is one that allows for individuals of various backgrounds to air their views, to strive, and of course thrive. And these are some of the lacunas. Therein lies some of the lacunas that are being exploited by certain individuals. Of course, as you know, this is the most populous country in Africa, and
mm,
it places us in a certain, on a certain um, pedestal, if you like. However, that comes with a lot of dilemma. The dilemma of having to tackle various interests and so on and so forth. And you also have issues around poverty. You have issues
mm.
around unemployment. You have issues around the various issues, which, of course, the government needs to address headlong, because these are some of the things that drive people into taking up arms and so on and so forth. So of course, these are the reasons why, completely eliminating terrorism, which has never happened anywhere in the world, if you look at it really.
True.
You can only mitigate, you can only curb, you can only reduce drastically. But as far as eliminating totally, it is not something that is realistic. And if we're going to face headlong the realities, we must appreciate that fact. So government needs to intervene, government needs to do a lot, because the primacy, like I said, of government is protection of lives and citizens, and the reason why armies exist is to protect the territorial integrity of the state.
I think you might have gotten a sneak peek of my notes here because as you were speaking you're just encroaching a bit to the direction where I want to take this conversation. The fact
Mhm.
that we are starting to see an international dimension of some sort here. These men that have just been arrested have reportedly had ties across the Maghreb region of the continent. They've also been linked with some of the attacks in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina Faso. To what extent is Nigeria's insurgency part of a much bigger regional security crisis, and to what extent does Nigeria bear the burden of being the only country that is seemingly actively trying to make this counter-terror efforts, that maybe some of the countries around Nigeria are not just simply putting in as much effort as you would expect them to, maybe granted because of the disparity between resources. Nigeria, the most populous country on the continent, the biggest economy, maybe, just maybe, there's more work and responsibility on Nigeria than some of its neighbors.
Well, to a significant extent, the internationalization of these terror groups, affects Nigeria significantly because, first and foremost, because of Nigeria's very porous borders. Well, because of Nigeria's size, first of all,
Mm.
because if we're talking about borders, we can decide to go the Trump way, and build walls. However, the ECOWAS article, UN article, ECOWAS Charter does not, I think Article 5 of that speaks to, either 3 or 5 or so, speaks to free movement of persons, goods, and services. And Nigeria is signatory to that. As a matter of fact, Nigeria is chair, or was chair. Nigeria was where ECOWAS was established, So these are some of the things that I've essentially, this is me just trying to understand the mind of government. I'm not in government circle, but I believe that
Mm.
these are some of the things that have essentially, you know, uh, tied the hands of government to do that, even where it perhaps it didn't even have the intention. But the point I'm trying to make is Nigeria's size, Nigeria's border area, is one of the key reasons why you find that the internationalization of terror groups and banditry becomes very easy. We have numerous borders around, very porous borders. From what we know, there are over, I think, if my memory serves me right, about 700 to 900 borders. And these borders, I think, from what we understand, only about just half or so of that are being manned by immigration and other security agencies. So you find that the porous nature of our border allows for people to, easily access the country in and out. And so this terror cells and terror group, and of course, you must understand where Nigeria is located.
Mm.
Nigeria has border with Niger. Nigeria has border with Cameroon. Nigeria has border with, a lot of these countries where, particularly those that link to the Sahel. And the Sahel is where, because it's Nigeria, through Borno in Nigeria, you have access to the Sahel up to um, Timbuktu, leading into Libya, and so on and so forth. So that's the Trans-Sahara route is essentially linked to Nigeria, and this
Mm.
used to be the destination for not just those across the Sahel, but even into the Middle East. So in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, when the Arabs will come to trade, this was essentially their stop point.
Mm.
Ghana a bit, but this was their stop point. And even here in Nigeria, it was northern Nigeria. And this is where historically the relationship between the old Kanem Borno Empire and Omar bin Khattab of old was established. So this goes to tell you how very long. Yes, there was I think in the fifth between the fifth and the seventh century, a letter was written from Umar bin Khattab, the old Umar bin Khattab. This was about over 1,000 years ago, to Kanem Borno Empire. So that link has always been there through the old Trans-Sahara route, which is essentially the second largest corridor in the world after the old Silk Road, which is what the
Mm.
Chinese are currently building the Belt and Road Initiative on. So essentially, this is just to give you a sneak peek into how very porous this border is, how very connected Nigeria is to these countries, the route that essentially gives room or rise to some of these things. Because when you have this strategic advantages in terms of route, in terms of position, in terms of geography, it also comes with certain, misgivings as well, or certain ills. People can take advantage of the situation and carry out certain activities. And so this is the reason why the internationalization of this terror group and terror cells have been made a lot more easier, on their part. Because the same way security personnel are trying to curb the situation, the terror groups are also grouping and regrouping and ensuring that they become more sophisticated, if not more sophisticated than the state, because there are a lot of angles to it. We've seen cases of external interferences. We've seen cases of external support from countries. Well, not there are no evidence to that. As academics, we always try to speak to evidence, but there are cases of sort. We've heard the congressman in the United States talk about U.S. aid sponsoring Boko Haram and other terror group, even though that is not substantiated. But this is coming from a very high level. This is a very high level speculation, and it
Mm.
gives, it creates shiver, as far as Nigeria and other countries or neighboring countries trying to curb these issues of terrorism and banditry across the border area. In fairness to these countries, they're doing fairly well. There's the multinational joint task force that have been established. Um, and adopted as a protocol. ECOWAS is throwing its weight behind this, even though the withdrawal of the ICE countries, speaking of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, has to a great extent dealt a blow to that effort. However, efforts have been made. The Chadian government is not sitting on its oars. They're doing
Mm.
the most that they can, or the most that they can. Whether that is good enough or not is something that is subjective and left for inquisition by people who are inquisitive. But the reality is that these countries are throwing their weight within the boundaries or borders of their own country and into the Lake Chad Basin. They're doing the most that they can to ensure that these issues are curbed. At some point, Idris Deby used to be the guy in the front. He used to, of course, you know the story of how what happened to him. It
Mm.
was as a result of leading from the front and ensuring that they curbed the situation of terrorism and other related vices across the border. So the multinational joint task force, I think it's in its second phase of its mandate of ensuring that they cut down activities of terrorism. They're doing the most that they can. And like you rightly pointed out, Nigeria is its backbone, considering the resources Nigeria has, not just in material, but in human.
Mm.
So, the personnel that Nigeria needs to provide. Nigeria has always been, in the lead as far as providing um, boots on the ground and equipment, of course, not just with the rise of terrorism. We have always been there. We have always been in Sao Tome and Principe. We were there in Cote d'Ivoire. We were there in the Gambia. We were there. We've been around. In Liberia, Nigeria was there. So Nigeria is the expectation is that Nigeria should be seen to be providing more,
Mm.
in terms of resources because of what we have. We must also remind our viewers that one out of every four African is a Nigerian, so naturally, the expectation would be that the expectation will be that Nigeria should provide more in terms of personnel, and of course, with the resources we have, this is the third largest producer of gas and the sixth highest producer of oil in the world. What other economic power do you need to provide more resources for such situation? Even though these resources are drying up, even though the population is expanding much more rapidly, and there's the need to ensure that these resources go around. So, yes, of course, Nigeria is doing the most that it can. The neighboring countries, in fairness to them, are also supporting as much as they can. But the internationalization of these terror groups, the external supports that these terror groups are getting, the interests that lie therein, makes this seem like something that cannot be curbed. But rest assured, these countries are doing the most that they can. The Joint Task Force is yielding result. As much as we see what we see happening on the ground, government needs to do more. More has to be done, and as a matter of fact, more should be done in the area of providing the basics of life. Because no matter how much you spend in trying to curb terrorism kinetically, it will never suffice until you spend as much, even if not much more, in the provision of the basic things, social amenity,
Mm,
that people need. Remember what Robert McNamara said, which was right. Development is security, and security is development. These things work in tandem. If government doesn't provide basic things of life, you will continue to see these things rear their head. So I think the conversation should begin to tilt more towards the root causes of terror, and not just on the terrorism related activities itself. And this is exactly what has created, the misgivings around the Bush's doctrine of trying to fight
mm,
terror. You're fighting terror when the root causes of terrorism have not been dealt with. The political issues, your subjugation of the Middle East, your interference in the Middle East has not been addressed. The bombs that are being thrown on 5-year-olds, 3-year-old, and killing them. And when they look at the shell of these bombs, they see the United States of America on them. What, you
mm,
expect this child to become 20 years old and come and hold your hands and walk down the street and sing the song "You Will Overcome"? I mean, that's been very naive. So these are the things that we need to this is the direction in which government needs to begin to look. If you don't provide basic amenities, if a man cannot stand for anything, he will fall. If a man doesn't stand for something, he will fall for anything. And a man who has a child in the house, he cannot provide for that child, can become wilder than the beast. This is just the
mm.
reality.
No, most definitely, Prof. We're going to leave on that note. Really, really appreciate you giving us the time, making a case there for Nigeria being a giant of Africa. I think in diplomatic circles we can all agree, but maybe not the Super Eagles anymore. That one is done. Professor Mukhtar, Imam, Jazakallah so much. Really, really appreciate you giving us the time this morning.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
There you go. Really, really important conversation there with Professor Mukhtar Imam. He's a Nigerian-based international relations expert, helping us understand the significance of Nigeria's arrest of two of its most wanted militant leaders, a move that authorities are calling a decisive victory, but one that also raises bigger questions about the resilience of insurgency on the African continent, in West Africa, and also in the Middle East. And I think he's making some very, very important points that we are only treating the symptoms of a bigger, kind of issue that we have on the African continent. I think these kind of arrests, these raids on these groups only treat the symptoms. I think the bigger issues that African governments and the leaders of the continent need to start looking at is the social dynamics of the continent, unemployment, poverty. And I think if you deal with those, I think you've began, I think, in a major, major way to counter terror on the African continent. And I think, yeah, congratulations to the authorities in Nigeria. But I think a whole lot more needs to be done, especially when it comes to, the socio-economic issues that the people of the continent and people of the region continue to struggle and grapple with. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be focusing home and we'll be talking about that visit of South Africa's army chief that sparked shockwaves. That visit was not sanctioned by the president of South Africa. And some are saying, well, there needs to be consequences for General Rutsani Mapoenya, who just returned from Iran. So, yeah, we're going to be sticking on that. We'll be speaking to Ricardo Texera. He's the editor of Protection Web, Defense and National Security, and is also Defense and National Security Analyst at Defense Web. See you after this.